So in general, in a typical non-real-time operating system, user doesn't have control over the scheduling. Okay, so but in real-time system give more control to the users for the scheduling. So in a real-time operating system, it is essential to allow the user to have some fine-grained control over task priority or other tasks. Let's look at some example. So user need to distinguish between hard real-time task and soft real-time task. So system might not know, so user have to specify which tasks are real-time and which tasks are hard real-time or soft real-time task. And sometimes the user also specify relative priorities within each priority class. So they might assign priority, and also they might assign relative priority within each priority class. And also the system might allow the user to specify or the control over paging or the swapping. So user has more control over in real-time system, and what process should be resident in main memory, and what kind of disk scheduling algorithms can be used, and what access right each process has in each priority class, and so on. So all of these, the user has more control over scheduling, real-time scheduling. That's what I mean by this slide. Okay. And another issue in real-time system is reliability. Reliability is more important in real-time system than conventional operating system, because in a non-real-time system, a system failure may result in a reduced level of service. So sometimes you just need to reboot the system, then the service is degraded, but you can continue because there is no critical damage to the system in general. But in real-time system, a failure can cause substantial impact on the system, sometimes catastrophic effect or consequence. So it can be a financial loss if it's a stock market, right? It's a real-time system, or it can be a major equipment damage in a plant or a nuclear plant or those kind of embedded system area. And also it can result in a loss of life if it's traffic control, or if it's maybe airline reservation or airplane control, and so on. So reliability is much more important in real-time systems. And the final issue is called fail-soft operation. Fail-soft means this is a characteristic that refers to the system ability to fail in such a way that it should preserve as much capability and data as possible. So even in a case of failure, it should preserve some data and also much of the capability as before. So the example is stability, and we say that a real-time system is stable if the system meets the deadlines of its most critical task, even if some of less critical task deadlines are missed. Okay, so the most important task, they should meet the deadline even in case of failure. It's called fail-soft operation. Okay. So to meet all these requirements, we have reviewed five characteristics. So determinism and responsiveness deals with the response time in case of external event, how fast it can handle the interrupt. So determinism is from the time of arrival of interrupt to when before the service begins. And then responsiveness means how this interrupt can be, how fast this interrupt can be serviced. And combined, it actually defines the response time to external events. So it must react to external events in a fast way. So this response time is characterized by determinism and responsiveness. And we also discuss user control in real-time system. We have give more control to the user for the scheduling, and it should be more reliable, and it should provide some face-soft operation even in the case of system failure. And to support all these characteristics, real-time operating system usually have the following characteristic features. So it should provide some fast process switching or thread switching, because if you want to react to the external event, you have to have some fast interrupt processing that require fast context switching. Right? Interrupt handling should be done at the kernel level. You should change the context from the user process to user mode to the kernel. This requires fast process or thread switching, which usually requires some multiple register file, multiple hardware context. So in a multi-threaded processor, they usually have like Intel's Core i5 or i7 processor that I mentioned. They are hardware multi-threading, SMT, simultaneous multi-threading. So they can every cycle run two different tasks every cycle, and that actually in the hardware they have two register files for each process or each thread, and that actually allow more fast context switching. And usually real-time operating system, the system size is small because it's usually used for embedded systems for small scale, but there are some large real-time systems also. In general, real-time operating systems are usually smaller than general purpose operating system, because it's not general purpose computing system, it's for some systems, some real-time embedded system. And it should respond to external events quickly, and it should allow some preemptive scheduling based on priority. It should minimize intervals during which interrupts are disabled. So to allow fast response, they have to minimize the duration of interrupt disable, because whenever interrupt is disabled, you cannot react to the external event. You should minimize this interval so that you have to react to external events quickly. And the short-term scheduler of this operating system is usually optimized for real-time tasks. And this short-term scheduler, fairness and minimizing average response time is not as important as in ordinary operating system, because the goal is try to meet the deadline, not for fairness or for response time. So what is important, or what is more important, is all hardware real-time tasks must complete or start by their deadlines, and software real-time tasks must complete by their deadlines as much as they can. Okay? These are the characteristics of real-time operating system. Let's look at real-time scheduling. We have 4 different scheduler. Each of these is different in terms of response time. So in the textbook there are another figure, but the author doesn't give more figures, so you can refer to the textbook in page 466. So the first scheduler is called round-robin preemptive scheduling. If you use round-robin scheduling, you are currently running this task, and there is an external event, and there is a request from a real-time process. I need to process this event as soon as they can. And because this is just round-robin scheduling, you put this real-time process at the end of this ready queue. Okay? So real-time process has to wait until this much. This is arrival of this event, and this is when this process is scheduled. So you have this much delay, and this is the scheduled time. Okay? But if you use priority-driven, non-preemptive scheduling, then whenever you have this request, you can schedule this real-time process at the head of this queue, ready queue. So this will be the next process to be run by the processor. But you have this much delay, okay, because you have to complete this process has to be blocked or has to be should use their time slice before the context switching. Okay, because it's non-preemptive scheduling. If you use preemptive scheduling, then there are some preemption points. You cannot always preempt any time, right? There are some preemption points. So you have to wait until some preemption point, and then real-time schedule process can preempt the current process. So you can reduce this delay a little bit further because this allows preemptive scheduling. And the last one is immediate preemption, right? As soon as you have a request from a real-time process, you preempt the current process, which is shown in the textbook. Okay, so there are levels of delay. This is actually response time. How long does it take to respond to the external event? Okay. So in general, real-time scheduling, we can classify into 4 different approaches based on whether the system performed the schedulability analysis and whether the analysis produce some schedule or it doesn't produce a schedule. So based on these 2 categories, you can classify into 4 different approaches. But in general, real-time scheduling is one of the most active research area in computer science because there are more and more real-time operating systems, which means the computer systems are applied to real-time systems more and more. Right? So it's covering more embedded systems, and previously it was just not a computer system before, but they are applying this computer system to other area, right? So you'll see more real-time operating systems in the future, and scheduling is still active area of research. So we can classify real-time scheduling into 4 different approaches. Whether it's static or dynamic. Static means it's done before execution. Dynamic means it's during execution. You schedule. And the first approach is called static table-driven approach. You do some static analysis of feasibility. You do some feasibility analysis, and you produce a schedule. Schedule means you predetermine which one you schedule and so on. Okay. And this is usually applied to periodic tasks whose arrival time, execution time, and deadlines are predictable. Whenever you have this environment, you can apply this kind of table-driven static approach because you know all this arrival time, execution time, and deadline. And for this, you can also use priority-driven preemptive approach. You still do the schedulability analysis, but no schedule is drawn up because this is just priority-driven, right? Priority-driven. So analysis is usually used to assign priorities to process. So traditional priority-driven preemptive scheduling can be used. So this is common in most non-real-time systems. If you want to handle real-time tasks in a non-real-time operating system, you can apply this kind of approach because they usually have priority-based preemptive scheduling. Okay. And these 2 other approaches are dynamic approach. The first one is dynamic planning-based approach. So you do some feasibility analysis, and then you produce a schedule. So this is doing feasibility analysis and schedule at runtime. Quite complex, right? And the final approach is dynamic best effort approach, which means you don't actually do some feasibility analysis, but the system tries to meet all the deadlines as much as they can. It's best effort approach. And if they miss the deadline, then all this process they have to abort if they miss their deadline because it's no longer useful. They cannot meet the deadline. And this is used by many commercial real-time operating systems. Okay, in general. Okay.
Do you have an example on commercial real-time systems?
There are some examples in the textbook.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can read the textbook. Yeah, some of them are quite famous. TinyOS is a small operating system used for sensor networks. And there is a real-time system called ECOS and other operating system for several different real-time systems. So many research in operating system, they are looking at this real-time operating system rather than general operating system, because general operating systems are quite mature area and it's driven by actual commercial systems or Linux open source environment. But real-time system, there are still active research. Okay.
When you have a real-time system, which is basically a network, and you have a server, and you have virtual machines inside the server, right? How does the scheduling change whenever you create a new virtual machine?
Virtual machine, we didn't discuss virtual machine, so that's the beyond the scope of this class, I don't think. Okay? So let's look at some deadline scheduling algorithms. So this is just general remarks on the real-time deadline scheduling. So real-time operating systems are designed with the goal of starting real-time tasks as rapidly as possible. They should be. And emphasize rapid interrupt handling and task dispatching. Right? That's what we have discussed so far. Real-time applications are generally not concerned with sheer speed. They are not concerned with performance or throughput. Instead, they are concerned with completing or starting tasks by their deadlines. Okay? And priorities provide a crude tool and do not capture the requirement of completion or initiation. So if you use priority-based schedule, you cannot guarantee the deadlines in general, because priority doesn't mean it's usually not enough. For deadline scheduling, the following information is usually used. For each process, we need to find out the ready time. That's the task becomes ready for execution. And starting deadline, time by which the task must begin. And completion deadline, the task must complete by this deadline. Processing time, how long does it take to complete, process this task. And the resource requirement and priority relative importance. And subtask structure. Sometimes a task can consist of a mandatory subtask and optional subtask. In this case, usually the mandatory subtask has a deadline and the other subtask might not. In this case, you only need to meet this deadline for this mandatory task and so on. So usually, as you will see in the next slide, they have this ready time, starting deadline, completion deadline, and service time or processing time. And based on this information, we can apply different deadline scheduling algorithms. These are the examples. So, execution profile of two tasks. We have task A and task B, which has this collection of process. And for each process, we have arrival time, and how long does it take, and ending deadline. Sometimes we have starting deadline and so on. So based on this kind of profile, we can apply different deadline scheduling. For this example, let's look at this three different scheduling algorithms. So we have process task A, which has 5 processes. A1 arrives at 0, A2 arrives at 20, and each of them has 10 execution time of 10 time units, and ending deadline is 20, 40, 60, and so on. And task B contains arrival at 0, 50, 100, and so on. Its service time, processing time is 25, ending deadline is 50, 100, and so on. This is shown by in the figure here. Okay, so A1. So these are periodic tasks. It arrives periodically every 20 time unit. Let's assume that this is 20 seconds or something like that. Okay, and this is A1's deadline, A2's deadline, A3's deadline, and so on. And B1 is arriving every 50 time units, and their deadlines are also specified by these. Okay, these are the ending deadline. They have to complete this process by this ending deadline. So if you use fixed priority scheduling and assume that A has priority, then we can schedule like this. Since A has priority, at the beginning there is only one task, so we execute A1, and this is the time slice. Okay, so after A1, then we try to schedule another task, but there is no other task. A1 has completed, and there is only B1. Okay, so we can schedule B1, and then A has arrived, so A has priority. So at the end of this time slice, we schedule A2. Okay, because A has priority. We are on the stack tab. Okay. And then after A2, so we meet A1's deadline, and we meet also A2's deadline, no other task. So we execute B1, but there is arrival of A3, so we assign A3. Okay, and then we are trying to execute B1, but B1's deadline has been missed. So it's no longer useful to assign processor to B1. So we instead execute B2. Okay. So far it's easy. Do you follow step top?
I can't just do B1 is
You have run B1 for 20 time units, so 5 time units are left, but you miss your B1's deadline because of A3 has been scheduled first because it has higher priority. Okay, so it's no longer useful to run B1 anymore because they missed their deadline, so you abort. Okay, and then you schedule B2 because B2 is the only process. Okay, and because A4 has priority, you allocate A4, and then B2, and then A5, and then remaining B2. So you only miss B1's deadlines if you use this fixed priority scheduling, assuming A has priority. Okay, easy. And if you assume B has priority, then since A1 and B1 arrived at the same time, you assign B1 first. Okay, after completion, you assign A2, and then you miss A1's deadline, right? A1's deadline. So there is no other task, so you assign A3, and then B2, because B2 has higher priority, and you run to completion. And then you miss A4's deadline because B2 has priority, and then you A5. So you miss 2 deadlines, A1 and A4. Okay? The final one is called earliest deadline scheduling. So you look at the deadline and you assign task which has the earliest deadline. Okay? So since A1, so you can order this deadline by this timeline, and A1 has the earliest deadline. So you assign A1, and which one has the next deadline? In this case, you have only A1 and B1, so you assign B1. Okay, allocate B1, and then A2, and then you continue B1. Okay, B1, and so on. So if you use earliest deadline scheduling, you can meet all of these deadlines. Okay, and so on. So it's quite simple. Okay.
What's happening when we miss the process?
When
When we miss the process.
what do you mean by miss the process?
The process B1 is missed.
Where?
And
Which
in
one?
And the second one?
Second one?
No.
This one?
No, the second one from the top.
Here?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
One
B1?
is missed.
Yeah, B1 is missed, so you abort the process B1 because you cannot meet the deadline. Then it's no longer useful. You just give up on B1, even though you have executed partially.
So the process is no longer executed.
Right, so it's gone from the system. Okay? Because the goal is to meeting the deadline, right? Not completion of the task. Okay, if you cannot meet the deadline, then
Well, this only works if you have a preemptive setting, so to speak. What if you have a non-preemptive? The scheduling must be really But we've talked about non-preemptive scheduling.
let's look at here. This is, I don't think is preemptive, right?
No, exactly.
It depends on the scheduling, I think. You can use preemptive scheduling or non-preemptive scheduling.
Yeah.
So it depends on the assumption, whether you use preemptive scheduling or non-preemptive scheduling. Okay. Let's look at the example for a periodic task. We have 5 tasks. These are the arrival time, execution time. In this case, we are trying to meet the starting deadline, not the ending deadline. For this example, we can use 3 different scheduling algorithms. Okay? And these are the arrival time of 5 tasks, and these are the starting deadlines. First one is called earliest deadline scheduling as before, but this is non-preemptive. So here it's missing M, typo. So earliest deadline scheduling. So this is the deadline. So because at the beginning we have only task A. Okay. So we assign task A first, but this is non-preemptive scheduling. So you run to completion of A. Okay. But B has arrived because it's non-preemptive scheduling. You miss a deadline of B, okay, and then C has arrived, and she has the earliest deadline. So you allocate CPU to task C, and then next deadline is E. So you assign E and then D, okay. So you miss B's deadline, okay. Assuming earliest deadline with non-preemptive scheduling. So maybe in the exam I should give exactly what kind of scheduling and whether it's preemptive or non-preemptive, and then you can schedule. Okay? You can draw this kind of figure. This is same as before, earliest deadline, but you can, if you know all these deadlines beforehand, you can sometimes, here the difference is, since there is no other task, you allocate A first, you assign A first. But since you know the deadline, and starting deadline of A is the latest, right? So you can schedule B first because B has the earliest deadline. So you can put the system in idle state. This is called earliest deadline with unforced idle time, assuming you allow idle time for the CPU.
How does system know that E will come?
Right, so this is the assumption, if the deadlines are known in advance. Okay, they will arrive and if they have information beforehand. Otherwise it cannot be used. Right?
So it's not real time then?
Maybe. Assuming, right. This is somewhat controversial, right? Because at this time B has not arrived, and since usually you don't know its deadline before it arrived, right? So that's, you can use only this kind of earliest deadline scheduling. But if you know beforehand, if your deadlines can be known in advance, then you can use this kind of schedule. Okay?
If you have multiple things with the same deadline, multiple processes coming in with the same deadline,
Okay.
and you have a non-preemptive
Scheduling.
And you wouldn't be able to finish for the deadline. What happens?
What happens? You execute, if there are priorities, you execute the first priority process, but if there is no priority, then maybe randomly, right? That's the only thing you can do, right? And you sometimes miss other deadlines. Okay? So the system is trying to do what they can do, right, as much as possible, but otherwise, sometimes you miss the deadlines, right? It's called best effort, right? You cannot exceed 100% CPU utilization, right? So that's the maximum. We will discuss the maximum, the bound of this scheduling in the following slide. So for periodic task, people have done some research. This is more advanced topics, okay? So for periodic tasks, we can use this kind of rate monotonic scheduling. Rate monotonic scheduling is called RMS. It's popular algorithm for periodic task. And from the paper, they argue that they should give highest priority to a process with the shortest period. If there are periodic tasks and some of the period is smaller, then you should give higher priority to process with smaller intervals. So highest priority is given to a process with the shortest period, and second highest priority is given to a process with second highest shortest period, and so on. So if you plot this process in terms of rate and in terms of priority, if the rate is higher, then you give higher priority. If the rate is lower, then you give lower priority. So this is called rate monotonic scheduling.
What do you mean by shortest period? Is that-
Period means period task, so this interval is shortest.
okay.
Then it's called shortest, and it has the higher rate.
Is it possible to implement a sort of scheduling that takes into account priority in like a sort of round robin thing? That you get, that for example you have 6 levels of priority. So if it's of the highest priority level, you give it 6, basically you allow it 6 times as much time as a level 1 priority, but it always executes all of them before starting again. Is it possible to implement that?
So you give more time, so if it's
Basically, you have 7 levels of priority.
7, okay.
So if it's of the lowest priority, when the round robin comes to it, it will only execute one time slice.
Okay.
If it's of the second lowest, it executes 2 time slices. If it's of the third lowest, 3 time slices, all the way up to the first one, which would execute 7 time slices before giving control to the
Okay.
next process. Is it possible to create a
But-
sort of scheduling like that? Would it have any benefit?
You can think,
Well, I think that it avoids certain problems.
but it's not real time, I guess.
No, but it
And-
just saying that graph, it kind of like it came.
Right. But just you're giving more time to a process with higher priority.
Higher priority.
And it can be 7 times more or more, 2 times more, it depends, right?
Yeah.
But that's one possible approach, but I'm not sure what is trying to optimize, what is the goal. It depends on the goal, whether it's for real-time system or whether it's for time-sharing environment, it depends. And so, oops, sorry. So this priority is a monotonically increasing function of their rate. Okay, so let's assume this kind of timing diagram. You have periodic task, which this is the interval or period or cycle. And so this arrived every interval, and this is its processing time, and this is some kind of idle time. Okay? So this execution time is called is a constant C, and this period is a constant variable t, tc. So if you have a task with a period of 50 milliseconds, then this period task occurs at a rate of 20 hertz, right? Every second you occur 20 times. Okay, so let's do some analysis. And so C is called execution time, and T is called period, and C divided by T is usually CPU utilization. Okay? And usually the execution time must be smaller than the period because they arrive periodically and they cannot exceed this period. Okay? So graphically, C divided by T is the utilization. If you run this process only, right? C over T is the CPU utilization. And C should be less than T, right? That should be obvious. Okay? In a monotonic RMS scheduling. So if you have n task, small n task, each one has this much utilization. Sum of all this utilization should be less than or equal to 1, right? You cannot exceed 100% CPU utilization, as I mentioned before, right? That's the maximum. And if it exceeds, then you have to give up some of the task. Okay? So this provides some upper bound on the number of tasks a scheduling algorithm can schedule. Okay? So, but for any particular algorithm, this kind of bound might be lower than 1, right? And for RMS, from the paper, they show that the following inequality holds that for RMS. So if you use rate monotonic scheduling, the sum of this utilization is usually should be less than or equal to this equation. Okay? If you use RMS. And if you are interested, you can read the papers. Okay? And they have done computation and they increase this number of tasks infinitely, and this is, they converge to this number. This is the actual lower bound, upper bound, lower bound of the upper bound. Okay? So you cannot exceed this number. But if you have only a single task, you can meet this 100% utilization. If you increase, it will be lower and lower, the bound become lower and lower. And at the end, it will converge to this number. Okay? Based on the education. Okay. Priority inversion is one of the issues for real-time scheduling, and priority inversion occurs when the system forces a higher priority task to wait for a lower priority task. Sometimes even if you don't real-time scheduling with deadline scheduling or whatsoever, then sometimes higher priority task has to wait for lower priority task. It can happen. That can happen. A simple example is if a lower priority task has locked a resource using a semaphore, okay, and higher priority task attempt to lock the same resource, but because it's locked by lower priority task, the higher priority task should wait or should block until the resource is released by this lower priority task. Okay, so higher priority task sometimes has to wait for lower priority task. It's called priority inversion. Okay, and this can happen in real-time systems. The actual example is called this Mars Pathfinder mission project. So they sent some robots called Pathfinder to Mars, and they didn't expect this kind of problem. And because of this priority inversion, there was some issues. They couldn't get the data. So the robot gathered and transmitted lots of data back to Earth. But a few days into the mission, after they released this robot on Mars, the software began experiencing some system resets. So they have some reset task trying to evaluate the system safety, and whenever system is unstable, then they reset the system, reboot. But they didn't expect the reset occurred frequently, right? It's only on emergency situation, but a few days into the mission, they experienced this kind of system reset again and again, okay? And each resulting in a loss of data, and they tried to trace these problems, and it was due to this priority inversion.
How did they solve it? Or did they just not solve it?
I don't know, maybe you can investigate.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Yeah, they might.
Or when updates, or
Yeah,
did they
that's-
just leave it like glitching in the middle of Mars?
Maybe they, I think, should have solved this problem, right? Because they,
And destroyed the Pathfinder.
okay, I guess. Maybe
They sent a new one to practice it.
you can give us an answer next next class, okay? You can look at some Wikipedia or okay. And there is more severe case of this priority inversion called unbounded priority inversion, and actually this problem was a case of this unbounded priority inversion. The duration of priority inversion depends not only on the time required to handle a shared resource, but also on the unpredictable actions of other unrelated tasks. Because of other unrelated tasks, this interaction, it can be more complex, and it's called unbounded priority inversion. Pathfinder software was a good example. We'll look at this example. And this is the Pathfinder example. Okay. Pathfinder software included the following three tasks in order of decreasing priority. Okay. So task 1 is the highest priority. It periodically checks the health of the system and also the software. And the task T2 process image data. Task 3 performs occasional tests on equipment status. And after T1, so this is the highest priority task. After T1 executes, the system reinitialize a timer to a maximum. So every time there is a reset, they set the timer to a maximum value, and then they do the operation. But sometimes they do this check unexpectedly. They do this because of priority inversion. They cannot perform this T1, and this counter exceeds this maximum number, and then the system resets or something like that. So if this timer ever expired, it is assumed that system integrity has been compromised. There is something wrong. Okay, the CPU is halted, all devices are reset, and the software is reloaded, and the space system starts all over again. Okay, and the recovery sequence does not complete until the next day. It takes a while. Okay, and the T1 and T3 share a common data structure protected by a binary semaphore. So let's look at this example. Okay, so small t is the timeline and large T is the task. We have task T1 and T2 and T3. This is the highest priority. Okay, T3 is the lowest priority. Okay, at T1, T3 begins. And at T2, T3 locks semaphore S, try to get some resource. Okay, at T3, T1 is preempted by T3 task is preempted by T1 because it has higher priority. Okay? And T1 is executing at time T4. T1 is blocked. T1 is blocked by T3 because it's sharing the same resource. It's try to attempt lock semaphore S, but it's locked by T3. Okay? So it's blocked, and T3 gets control again, and T3 continues execution. By time T5, there is another task T2, which has higher priority. It preempts T3. Okay? So T2 is running. After T2 complete, T3 is coming back, and it's releasing semaphore S and releasing the resource. And then T1 can resume, and T1 is locked the semaphore and get the resource, and then T1 continues. Okay? Step top again. Okay, so in this case, even though T1 has the highest priority, T1 is waiting for both T2 and T3 complete. This is priority inversion. Okay, and T2 is also interacting, which is unrelated task, right? And because of this delay, T1 failed to reset the timer, right? T1 is trying to do something, but it cannot reset the timer in time, which means timer expired. Timer expired, and whenever the timer expired, then the system integrity has been compromised, they assume, and they start all over. They reset, and then software is all reloaded, which means they lose their data, and then they start again. Okay? So this one was a problem. Okay? For the Pathfinder. And how this can be solved? Solved by priority inheritance. Priority inheritance. Priority inheritance is a lower priority task inherits the priority of any higher priority task pending on a resource they share. So in this case, T1 and T3 are sharing the same resource. The problem is T2 is intervening this T1, T3 interaction, okay, which caused this much delay. So in this case, T3 is inheriting the priority of T1, which has the highest priority. So T2 cannot intervene this interaction. Okay, let's look at this example again. T3 church, and it's locking a variable semaphore, and it's preempted by T1, and T1 is blocked because T3 has the semaphore. Okay, but here, as soon as it's preempted by T1 and T1 is blocked, whenever this T1 is blocked, there is a priority inheritance occurs. So this priority change takes place as soon as the higher priority task blocks on the resource. So in this case, priority inheritance occurs, and T3 has the same priority as T1. Okay, this is called priority inheritance. And then T3 can be scheduled ahead of T2 because T3 now has higher priority than T2 because of this inheritance. Okay? So T3 can continue, and T3 unlocks semaphore S and releases the resource, and then T1 can continue, and then T2 can go on, proceed. Okay? So they can reduce this delay, and this is called priority inheritance, and the problem was solved by this technique called priority inheritance. As soon as this higher priority and lower priority task, there is a priority inversion, they give the same priority to a lower priority task to prevent another task from intervening this interaction. Okay? And they solve the problem, and these are the homeworks. Okay? homeworks are due by next Tuesday.
근데 세마포를 가지고 있으면요.
You can speak in English.
T3 has a semaphore, and when T1 is trying to preempt T3,
Okay.
because, T1 has a higher priority than
Yeah, higher priority. Yes.
but T1 cannot preempt T3 because of semaphore, right?
No. So it doesn't know whether it's using the same resource or same semaphore. At this point, it knows that it's trying to lock semaphore S. And at this time, it knows that this is locked by T3. But before that, it's not using any of the resource they share, and it's independent with test. Okay? Other question?
Question about the scheduling for real-time system. Does it, the task on real-time system separate by hard and soft?
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean soft? Hard should abort all the process if it missed the deadline, and soft should continue after.
Right, hard real-time task should be aborted if they miss their deadline. But soft real-time task can continue because this is more best effort approach. Examples are maybe video streaming. Video streaming should be done at real time, otherwise use so some disruption. But it's still okay, right?
So
After
if you're studying further in the scheduling, should we consider using both soft and hard, or just concentrate on the scheduling on hard only?
so this kind of deadline scheduling means these are hard deadline example, hard real-time task example. So maybe I can specify exactly these are hard deadlines. Soft real-time task, it's just you can do best effort approach, right? That's what you can do best. But you don't have to abort, right? These are the examples for hard real-time tasks. Other question? You can speak in English. Solution?
Our text only have a problem, but
Oh, really?
quiz.
So this might be an old slide, or let me check. Okay. So you have up to 8, right? So maybe remove these then, right? 9, 15, 16. Let's go to I/O, input and output. So in general, I/O device can be classified into 3 different categories: human readable, machine readable, and communication device. So there are many different classifications. This is one of the classifications discussed in the textbook. So human readable devices are printers, terminals, video display, keyboards, mouse. Those are users are interacting with computers. And machine readable devices are disk drive, USB, sensors and controllers, right? And communication devices are modems, digital line drivers, and so on. Okay, Wi-Fi. And each of these I/O devices has different speed of data transfer. It's called data rate. The fastest one is gigabit Ethernet, should be gigabits per second. Right? Graphic display is also require fast transfer rate, almost close to gigabit level. And hard disk drive, Ethernet, maybe 100 megabps, or this is 10 megabps, right? And optical disk and so on. So you can order the I/O device in terms of data transfer rate. The techniques for I/O can be classified into 3 different types: programmed I/O, interrupt-driven I/O, or direct memory access. And programmed I/O means the processor issues an I/O command or I/O instruction on behalf of a process to an I/O module. And whenever it issue this I/O instruction, and because I/O devices are usually slow, they sometimes do a busy wait until this I/O operation complete before they proceed. So usually before, this is early form of input and output processing, and they use input and output instruction. Usually they can use memory read or write instruction. So writing to some memory address, which is called I/O port, can be a output. Reading from I/O port is an input. You can read or write directly. Okay? So to copy from I/O device to memory, you have to read to the register from an I/O device, and then you have to store into a memory location. Okay? It's done by the processor by an instruction. It's called programmed I/O. Programmed I/O. It should be very slow. And if you are doing a read from an input device, let's say keyboard, and keyboard is very slow, and processor is still reading until it's reading a value from the keyboard and store into a register. And then you can store it into memory one by one. It's called programmed I/O. Interrupt-driven I/O. You still do an I/O instruction or I/O command on behalf of the process, and you can use non-blocking or blocking. Non-blocking means after they issue an I/O instruction, right, read or write to an I/O port, and they can continue. And then they can determine the I/O completion by the interrupt. Because by the interrupt, I/O device signals the processor that I/O instruction is complete, and then they know that I/O has been complete. Okay? But the I/O instruction can be non-blocking, which means the processor continues to execute next instruction after issuing I/O instruction. It's called non-blocking. Blocking means the current process should be blocked until there is an interrupt. Okay? Because it's blocked, you can schedule other task. Okay? But both of them are interrupt-driven I/O. Okay? Direct memory access is you have a DMA module, and the processor is not involved in actual data transfer. Processor ask DMA module for a block transfer, and then this DMA module can do a block transfer between I/O device to memory directly without involving processor. And at the end of this transfer, at the end of completion, the DMA module interrupts the processor. Okay, this is called DMA. This is more advanced. Nowadays, we are all using DMA. Okay, DMA. So I/O techniques can be classified into two dimensions. One is whether they don't use interrupt, whether they use interrupt. I/O to memory transfer is through the processor or directly by DMA module. So programmed I/O, they don't use interrupt, and they do this transfer through the processor. Okay? But they still can use interrupt. In this case, it's interrupt-driven I/O. And DMA is data transfer is directly from I/O module to memory, and they also use interrupt. Okay? And this is evolution of this I/O function. So maybe initially the processor CPU directly controls the peripheral device, right? But I/O device is so slow, so and then they come up with this programmed I/O. So they sometimes use special I/O command to control this peripheral device, but they use programmed I/O. They do a read or write instruction, I/O instruction, and without interrupt. At this time, I/O controller or I/O module is added. Programmed I/O with interrupt means same configuration, but they now allow interrupt. So the processor can continue or block, and you can schedule other tasks, or you can continue. And then they come up with the DMA, and I/O module or DMA module is given direct control of this I/O device and memory of the data transfer. And for this DMA, there might be separate DMA controller, or DMA controller can be combined with IO module. Okay, there are different configurations for DMA. And then IO module is enhanced to become a separate processor. It's becoming more complex and complex. It's programmable device, and it's called IO channel. They have specialized instruction tailored for input and output. And then IO channel becomes IO processor if it has its own local memory. Okay, so it's called IO processor. These are the evolution. So this is just general trend. Okay, trend. DMA block diagram. So usually the processor issues a command to DMA module, and they give this information whether they are doing read or write by activating this signal. And they should provide the address of IO device and the starting address of the memory, right? And how many words they will transfer. And then after they provide this information, DMA module can directly transfer their data to memory directly, okay, without CPU involvement. After the completion, DMA module interrupts the processor, okay? And DMA can be a separate module, and they might share a single bus, okay? And there can be processor, IO, and memory. And there can be this kind of configuration. DMA can be integrated with IO module, okay? So IO device itself has some direct DMA capability, and or a single DMA module can control two different IO devices in the same shared bus architecture, where they can have multiple bus. So system bus is usually a bus connecting CPU to the memory, which is called system bus. And you have IO bus that's connected all these IO device into a DMA. So this is some conceptual figure. The actual system is already different, right? Maybe if I have time, I'll give you some example of Pentium 4 or Core i7, how the actual system configuration is. It has multiple levels of bus, and we have chipsets and so on. Okay, but conceptually we can classify it. We can view different configurations. Design objective. So in general, IO system should be as efficient as possible, should be as general as possible. So efficiency is a major effort in IO design because IO operations are often become a bottleneck. IO is much slower than memory and CPU. Most IO devices are extremely slow compared to memory and processor, and most of the research is focused on improving the speed of this IO. So we'll discuss different functions. So we'll discuss buffering, which is improving the IO performance, and this is magnetic, and disk scheduling, and then RAID. RAID means parallel disk. You can improve the disk access much faster with this parallel disk arrays. So they usually focus on this efficiency. Another area is generality. It's desirable to handle all devices in a uniform manner. At a user level, you don't want to focus on each device characteristics. You want to handle this device in the same manner. The way process view IO device and the way operating system manage IO device and operation should be as general as possible. You want to hide the details of device IO, so the user process and upper levels of operating system see device in terms of general functions such as read, write, open, and close. So all of these IO devices, you should be able to operate with this kind of general function, read, write, open, and close. But low level operating system should handle, but it's concealed by the layers of this operating system. And the diversity of device makes it difficult to achieve true generality because there are depending on the device, it has different characteristics. But you should make the IO system as general as possible. Okay, these are the two general trends. Okay, let's continue next.